Hello, Las Vegas. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Golf at the Park, Angel Park Golf Club's weekly interview show. I want to thank you for liking and commenting on the videos. We're running contests on the comments, giving away free buckets of balls and rounds of golf on our Cloud 9. So please remember to comment. I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel as well. Had someone this week ask me if subscribing to the channel costs any money. It does not. So for those of you who are new to YouTube, subscribing just means that you'll be updated when new content and episodes are posted here once a week. So go ahead and smash that subscribe button as well. On this show this week, we have somebody who is really, I've wanted on the show since the beginning. He was the original director of golf here at Angel Park and had that title for the first 10 plus years that we were open. He also has been inducted into the Western State University Golf Hall of Fame. And on top of that, he's been introduced and inducted into the PGA Southwest Section Hall of Fame.
So you got to be careful when those things happen. They're an honor, but at the same time, it's for people that are dying or have died.
I know
they're either on their way or they're there. So as soon as that happened, I had to go to the doctor and get some sort of a health update.
I knew you wanted to get that in. He's also a little bit humble. He is also my dad. So we wanted to shoot this episode and air it on the week of the U.S. Open. It's a really neat tradition that golf has. The U.S. Open final round every year is on Father's Day. So yeah, that's why we're doing this episode this week. And on that note, we're going to start at the beginning. But it's interesting, you probably heard me bring up on earlier shows that I'm a third generation golfer, which makes, I didn't even introduce him. His name is Ed Francese. Ed, thank you for coming on to the show.
Dad.
Ed, Dad, is a second generation golfer and passed down the game from his father, Joe Francese. So why don't we actually, since it's Father's Day and it is part of the golf story, why don't you tell us a little bit about how the old pro got into the game of golf?
Yeah, so my father, your grandfather, they were a very poor family. His parents, as youngsters, maybe late teens, early 20s, left Torino, Italy, went through Ellis Island. They had a little bit of money. They were farmers, basically, and they wanted to, come to America for their dream and make a better life. So they ended up in Pennsylvania, thought it looked great, but they didn't have enough money to buy any land in Pennsylvania. So somebody told them it was cheaper if they went west. So then they go to Missouri. It's nice. They still don't have enough money to buy anything there. So they end up in eastern Arizona down by the Gila River. And somebody told them, well, you better buy here because if you go any farther west, it's California, it's more expensive.
Even more expensive.
So they ended up in a really small community along the Arizona-New Mexico border called Duncan, Arizona.
Yeah. It's hard to find.
It's small. It's small.
And so tell us a little bit about his childhood. He was a really good athlete, which eventually gets him into golf. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think they had a pretty tough life. The farm was right next to the river, and every 10, 12 years it would flood, and they'd have to start over again. They were maybe one of the few Catholic families in a small Mormon community. So life was just tough. But he went to school, grade school through high school in Duncan, and an achievement that the community takes a great deal of pride in, and he did too, was that his sophomore, junior, and senior year, 38, 39, and 40, they won the state high school basketball championship for Arizona. And that was before there was classifications, so, and different sizes of schools. So the town of Duncan was about 700 people, maybe 200 people kindergarten through grade school or through high school.
And they were beating Phoenix and Tucson in the state
titles. And Phoenix Union, Phoenix North, and Tucson High were the only schools in those big metro areas, and they had 3,500 kids. So for this little community to win it 3 years in a row, it was terrific. A lot of pride in that. Also from Duncan was the first female Supreme Court judge in Sandra Day O'Connor. So she's the most famous person from Duncan. And and it still exists, but it's having a tough time.
So for college, he was good enough to get scholarships to the University of Arizona on both basketball and the football teams, right?
Yeah, so they're a Catholic family. He got a scholarship to Loyola Chicago, also Loyola in L.A., but he was the youngest of his mother's three boys, and his father died when he was 3, and she never remarried. So she really wanted her youngest son to stay close, so he went to the University of Arizona.
And was a really good athlete, but unfortunately not the best student.
Right. And then after being there for a year, he enlisted World War II was starting.
Tell us just a quick bit about that, because he was actually in kind of a famous place overseas.
Yeah, a significant location. Anyway, he spent 4.5 years in the South Pacific, bouncing around wherever they were assigned. And at the end of the war, he was on the island of Tinian. And Tinian is noted as the base for the Enola Gay that flew over Japan and dropped the bomb on Hiroshima.
Right.
He said that there was a lot of security. There were 3 different runways, and the rank and file was not allowed on one of the runways. So he didn't know what was going on over there. He just knew he was not supposed to be over there. So.
That's really interesting. So he comes back from the war, and how does he get into golf?
In grade school and high school, his much older half brother had a job that he had to go back to Phoenix once a month for a report, and he ran the water district for the southeast part of Arizona, and so he had to go back and give a report to the governor. And so each time they did, he would take his three brothers, half brothers, and they would stay overnight, and they would play golf somewhere in the Phoenix area. Now, there were only like 4 or 5 golf courses, but they would play once a month. So he was introduced to golf then, and there was a small golf course just outside of Duncan that the mines owned, and he could go play there.
And then mining actually took him out of the state, so I believe Utah. So how did he end up getting from Arizona to Utah and eventually Colorado?
So after the war, he finished school at Flagstaff at NAU, and had a teacher's certificate. Was 6 hours short of a master's degree, but he went to school on a GI Bill. And then after that, he got a job with Phelps Dodge at Greenlee Golf Course, which is between Duncan and Morenci. And it was really for the miners to they would go party there, stay out of trouble, and things worked really well there. Small 9-hole golf course, and Phelps Dodge had an even bigger operation at Clarkdale. And so they asked him to go over there and run that golf course. And while he was there, Charlie Steen hit uranium. And during the Cold War, uranium was important to the atomic threat that was being used by Russia and the United States. Anyway, Steen wanted a golf course there. So he went and built a similar golf course, 9-hole, small community golf course. And I went to the 4th and 5th grade while that was happening in Moab. And then Montrose, Colorado recruited him. He built another 9-hole golf course, kind of probably his best golf course that he built out of the 4. And he just lived and retired there after 35 years. So that's where I went to school.
And he built it by himself because he was not only a member of the PGA, he was also a member of the golf course superintendents, right?
Yeah. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were a lot of small community golf courses across the United States. Now there are a lot more 18-hole golf courses. But if you had a person that could be the superintendent and the golf pro at the same time, then you had a person that could actually do 2 duties, but you would only have 1 paycheck. So yeah, he was important to the operation and getting it built. And then he had an incentive to build it right, because then he was the one going to have to stay and run it.
Right. And so now you start playing golf in your early teens, 12, 13, at Montrose. I know you played a little bit in Utah, but you really start playing in Montrose.
Yes, I did.
So let's start your golf story.
So my father was tough. He was demanding. He's domineering, actually. And so he just said I was either going to work or I was going to go to school, but I wasn't going to hang around town with any of the other kids.
Right.
And so actually in the 7th and 8th grade, I played golf, but there was nothing to play in, no events, and I caddied a lot. And so that made a little extra money, and I stayed on the golf course and fulfilled my dad's demands of staying out of trouble.
And then, so take us into high school.
High school, I tried to play the other sports, football, basketball, and baseball, and I just wasn't good enough. But in golf, I showed some promise. So I devoted a lot more time to golf and playing. I did play all 4 years. We played pretty well in state championships. Back then, in this is now the middle 60s, there were 2 major junior tournaments in the United States, and one has always been the USGA Junior Amateur. The other one was the International JC tournament, and in that tournament, they only took the best 4 players from each state. So there were 200 players that would show up. A few guys from Europe and a few guys from South America would come over. You had to be under 18 to play, and I was lucky enough. I qualified at 15, 16, and 17 to go play.
So you were playing pretty well against a lot of the better players your age in the country.
Yeah.
And good enough to get a golf scholarship. So tell us a little bit about getting into college golf.
So I suppose I was my sophomore year in high school.
Actually, that takes you back to caddying a little bit too, right?
My sophomore year in high school, Dad was talking about, Mom, we're talking about what am I going to do, and I wanted to go to college. And they said, well, we don't have any money, so you better figure out a way to be smart or get an athletic scholarship. So I did apply for a Chick Evans scholarship, which was really well developed in Chicago by the Western Golf Association in the 60s, but it was brand new in a couple schools in the West. And the University of Colorado had a program. And you had to be eligible, you had to have financial need, which we met. You had to have 2 years minimum of caddying. You had to have recommendations from the club that you were a respectable caddy. And then you had to be in the top 20% of your class. So I did. I was earned and did receive a Chick Evans scholarship to the University of Colorado.
Which is still around to this day.
Yeah, back then I was accepted to school. I was assigned to Willard Hall, but now they have their own house. It's not a fraternity, but it's as well established as a fraternity. And across all the universities in the United States, there's 1,100 kids this year going to school on a Chick Evans scholarship.
This year. That's really great. So, but you don't end up at University of Colorado because NAU is going to give you a little bit more money to go to school, right?
So the Evans scholarship didn't pay everything. You know, it was probably pay 50, 60%. And I was going to do that. And then in July, the NAU called and said they had just hired a new golf coach. He had 2 new scholarships that hadn't been awarded to anybody, and it paid about 90% of my educational costs. So I went there for that reason. I went there because I wanted to play golf, and I could drive off of the mountain from Flagstaff into Sedona, just 40 miles, and I could play year-round. At Boulder, I would be in the gym working out during the winter and no golf.
Right. So, and we'll get back to Sedona because that's where you end up after school. But then you go to Western State in Gunnison, Colorado, and that's where you finished your degrees. Tell us a little bit about Western State.
A small NAIA level school, and they had a golf team, and they played in the Rocky Mountain Conference, which they had the mountain division, the plain division. So I think there were 17 schools, 8 or 9 in Wyoming and Colorado in the mountains, and then they had 7 or 8 out in the plains in Kansas and Nebraska. So we played in that conference, played other events at the Air Academy and against CU and stuff.
And your mentor in golf, you met in Sedona, right? Why don't you tell us a little bit about him and how after you graduate, you end up back in Arizona?
Hub Goyen was the golf pro at a new golf course in Sedona in 1967. So that's where we played when I went to NAU. And he really was a mentor. He's a great friend, a really good golf professional. and he gave me my first job. So after graduating from Western, I went to work.
And a couple of things happened in Sedona. You met your first wife, my mother, and I was born in Sedona. And that's kind of an interesting story because you didn't have any health insurance. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how I was lucky enough to be born in a hospital?
So isn't this ironic? It's Father's Day that you're going to release this. And as an assistant pro, we didn't have any health insurance. But Bonnie had been going to a general practitioner that was going to deliver the baby, and he was a golfer. And he had 3 kids in early teens, 10, 11, 12, 13. And he knew I didn't make any money. And so we made a deal. He was the one that came up with the idea, and I jumped at it. He said, "I won't charge you to deliver your first child." He said, "But I want you to give my kids golf lessons for the next 2 summers." And I said, "Deal."
So I was bartered for. I love that. That's one of my favorites. So we're getting into the mid-70s now, and this is where you're going to start trying to play professionally. So why don't you take us through the early steps of that and your time trying to compete with the players on the tour?
There must be a million people, young guys, and now young women, but that say, "I want to be a golf pro. I want to play on the tour." And it's really hard to do, and it's really hard to get there. My only avenue was to go through as a traditional golf pro, go through the apprentice program, play in all of their events as the club professional events in a small area like Arizona or Southwest United States. And that's what I did. And so I would work as a traditional golf pro, and then I would play in events. I'd drive away for 1, 2, 3 days.
And in 1977, you get a couple of sponsors, small, but still you get a little bit of money. Tell us about how you pack your car up and you try to drive around the country and start competing in not just sectional events, regional events.
Yeah, so last month, Michael Block,
who took the world by storm, the PGA Championship. He finished tied for 10th, which means he gets to go back. Everybody who's watching this knows the Michael Block story, but it does have a kind of a tie to how you ended up doing something in 1977.
My path was exactly his path. A golf pro at a club, and won a few events, won the section championship. And through different qualifications, each year the PGA of America has 20 club pros that are eligible to play in their national championship, which is the tour event, the PGA. So I did qualify, and I was frightened, and I teed off at Pebble Beach in 1977.
So you played the PGA Championship at Pebble Beach, which is one of my favorite stories because you got to play in a major. How well did you do?
I missed the cut. I was not a Michael Block story. I was frightened, ill-prepared, but yeah, I mean, it was fun. It was great.
And as you're playing on the tour, and I know it was a short stint, one of my favorite stories is about you going in and seeing a movie that you told me years later really, really kind of changed you and affected you. You went into the movie different than you came out of it, almost that very year. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was a tour member in 77, and that starts in January. And so your mom and you and Tony were in California living with her parents, and I had a little car and was trying to drive and play golf. And I wasn't doing very well. And being by yourself and driving into L.A. and not even knowing where the golf courses are, or driving into Miami and not knowing where it is, it was just tough. I found it really difficult. Had very little money. Some guys flew. I was driving. Some guys stayed at nice places. I was staying at Days Inn, which at that time was even cheaper than Motel 6. But anyway, while I was at L.A. trying to qualify for the L.A. Open, I played golf with Ed Doherty. And he was a guy that had played the tour for a few years, minor success, enough to stay there. But anyway, he was from Philadelphia, and we were playing a practice round at L.A. North, which actually was a qualifying site in '77 for the LA Open, and they're going to have the U.S. Open there in in a couple of weeks. And so we also were assigned to Annandale, but as a qualifying site. But Ed Doherty said he had just seen the best movie of his life, and he was from Philadelphia, and it was about a boxer from Philadelphia. And he said, "You want to go to a movie?" I said, "Well, of course." So I had no idea what I was walking into, but it was inspiring. It was uplifting. And so the next day, I go to the qualifying, and I really played pretty well. I have like a 15-footer on the last hole to qualify. There were 4 spots at each place, and I missed it, and I went into the alternate playoff, and I ended up 4th alternate, and they have 10, but I ended up 4th alternate, knew I wouldn't get in, and the next tournament was Inverrary in Miami Beach. And
so you had to drive across
I'm from
the country.
LA. I'm in LA, and so I decided, well, I get on the road and go. I'll at least get to Phoenix tonight. And so I had a 4-day drive. So yeah.
And you found out on the way to Miami.
Yeah, the 8th qualifier got in.
So you left and you would have gotten in.
Yeah, I would have if I'd have been at the golf course. Yeah.
That's fun. And I know you don't like to talk too much about that. So now is the transition where you go back to being a club pro, bounce around Arizona quite a bit. Why don't you just tell us a quick, why don't we just, to cover them really fast, talk about each club you worked at in Arizona. Just list them off because we moved around a little bit when we were young.
Yeah, I was always looking for a better job, a little more money. The family was growing. So I was an assistant pro at Continental Country Club in Flagstaff and at Phoenix Country Club. I was the head golf professional at El Conquistador in Tucson, and then at Pinetop, Arizona at Pinetop Country Club. And then in 1989, so this all started in '78, and then in 1989, I moved to Las Vegas.
Ended up coming here. So now we're at the Angel Park part of the story, which we'll spend some time on. Start at the beginning, though. How do you end up bringing us as a family here to start Angel Park?
They were looking for a director of golf, somebody to run the golf operation at Angel Park, and it was under construction. And we were invited over. Jerry Hawley was the guy that was working with Gary Vickers and trying to find a golf professional. So we were invited over. So we drove over, and it was 1989 and February, I think, or January. And Gary Vickers meets us at the Porte Cochere. He had a room for us at Circus because he knew I was bringing the entire family. Yeah. And so when he shakes my hand and welcomes me, he also hands you, Tony, and Jody each a $20 roll of quarters and said, "Go upstairs. My wife's going to take you upstairs to the arcade while I talk to your dad." So an hour and a half later, you guys come back, and I'm apprehensive. I don't know whether I want this job or not, but you guys say this is the greatest place in the world. You had all this money. You had all these prizes. You had the fun at the arcade. We got to live here.
That's so fun.
That's a devious trick on Gary's part, wasn't it?
Tell us a little bit about what Angel Park looked like at the beginning. You had to drive up West Cliff. There, Summerlin Parkway existed. It was built, but it wasn't open yet. Just tell us a little bit about stepping on property at Angel Park at the beginning.
Well, it was all rock. There wasn't any topsoil. It was in disarray, but we said we would do the job, so we did. And Gary Vickers had fired about 2 months in. He had engaged Arnold Palmer and Ed Say to design and actually build the golf course, and they got a golf course contractor. And a couple of months in, Gary was really disappointed, upset, and he fired Palmer and the group, and he fired the contractor. So he went downtown and rented some construction equipment from the Caterpillar guy, the dealer, and he went to the Union Hall and hired 7 or 8 operators of heavy equipment, but they'd never built a golf course. So then Gary would drive out every morning and give them instructions, stand on the hood of his car, his Suburban, and tell him he wanted a mound this high and a mound over there that high. And anyway, the golf course ended up being built.
Right. And so there's a couple of years there where Arnold Palmer's no longer affiliated. And there are some funny stories back when it was just a trailer out there next to the range. The clubhouse hadn't been built yet. One of my favorite stories is one afternoon you get a golf cart. A guest puts the golf cart in the lake over on 9 of the Palm. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you solved that problem?
Yeah, so we had a really nice guy. Jim Oscarson was an assistant pro, and he was from Seattle or Washington. Anyway, he had a truck. He had a truck with a trailer hitch. And so I just walked in after I saw the cart. I could just barely see the roof of the cart in the lake. And I came back and I said, I knew Jim had the truck and they didn't have any other equipment available. And so I said, Jim, what do you drink? And he said, Crown Royal. And I said, okay, I want the keys to your truck and I'm going to get you a bottle of Crown Royal. And so I went to Home Depot, or someplace, and bought a hardware store and bought a rope. And then we tied it onto the trailer hitch of his truck and we pulled the cart out of the lake.
I love that story so much. Another crazy story, probably the craziest story at Angel Park ever. Why don't you tell us about the day that you got a phone call very early in the morning about the tunnel over there on the Palm?
So we won't go into the specifics, but yes, Joe Chiquette had called me. He was a superintendent, and early 5:30, 5:45, and he said, we got a problem in the tunnel going to the Palm Golf Course. And he explained that there had been some sort of a cult activity in the tunnel. They built a huge bonfire. The place was full of smoke and silt, but they also had some animal sacrifices, a bunch of graffiti and stuff that was written on the wall. So I saw this and was horrified. And I said, Joe, can you clean it up? And he said he would. And I went back to the golf shop and we just closed the golf course for the day. And I handed out free golf to everybody that had a tee time and just told them, I'm sorry that we just can't play. We didn't tell them what happened. We didn't call the press. We didn't want this to be known at all.
Oh, I think that's one of the only times the story's been retold, but I tend to tell it every once in a while when the flooding happens and we have to close the Palm Golf Course and they say, oh, it's full of water. And I said, we've had to close it for worse reasons than that before. Yeah. So I like that story too. So tell us a little bit about how it gets us to about 1991, and that's where Orrin Vincent and Bob Marshall, the two guys that started OB Sports, they come in. Why don't you tell us about how that starts, because they ran Angel Park, all the way up until Troon bought them a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So Gary Vickers had fired the Palmer Group, fired the contractor, and had a tough time finishing it on time. So he had to go back and tell the investors, which was the Cargill Group, and the Waycross Family Trust, that he needed more money and more time. They were pretty upset. And they did, though. They came out and they did look at it and say, okay. So they gave him some more money and another 3 months to finish the project. He called them back, said, I'm still not done, can't do it. I need more money. And they said no. And so Gary had, in the meantime, knew this was going to happen, made a deal verbally with Steve Wynn, that the Mirage was under construction and Steve Wynn was going to take the place of the Cargills, buy them out, and this was going to be a golf course for the Mirage. Shadow Creek was under construction and was going to be for the high roller, the exclusive player. This was going to be for all other players at the Mirage. Now, the bankruptcy bought Gary some time. During that bankruptcy and the proceedings that needed to have the city approve Steve Wynn as the new investor, Steve Wynn decided he didn't want to do that. And so at that time, the bankruptcy judge said, well, okay, it's going to go to the Cargills. So the Cargills had an unfinished project, and they interviewed OB Sports and came to an agreement and said, you have 90 days. And in the 90 days, we want you to operate the golf course as it is, come up with another plan. We don't know whether we're going to go forward or not. We've already got more money in it than we intended. But you come up with a 5-year plan, and if we like it, then we're going to ask you to execute the plan.
Right. And that's actually a little bit about how Arnold Palmer comes back into the fold for the grand opening, because Arnold Palmer played here in 91 or 92 for the grand opening. How does that end up happening? I believe Orrin had something to do with that.
Oh, he was instrumental. So Orrin Vincent and Bob Marshall were the owners of OB Sports. And they had just finished a golf course in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in '86 called Teton Pines with Arnold Palmer. They had a great relationship. And so Orrin had talked to Palmer and said, look, we're going to finish this up. We need you to come out as a big splash for a grand opening.
Yeah. And the T-shirts, what was the T-shirt story?
So reluctantly, Palmer didn't really want to come back because he wasn't fully paid and he was kicked off the job for no real good reason in Arnold's mind. But Orrin assured him that it wouldn't be an embarrassment. It would actually be great, and that the people in Las Vegas would love him. So he didn't tell Palmer. Palmer agreed to come out for one day, and he was going to play 18 holes, but he didn't know where the holes went because he didn't build the golf course. So Orrin assigned me as his caddy, and we played with Governor Bob Miller, just the two of them. And Orrin printed up 5,000 white T-shirts that said Arnie's Army. And he invited anybody from town that wanted to come out. So the sportscasters, the week before the event, announced it to everybody. And so we had 5,000 people out here with Arnie's Army T-shirts.
And
Arnold loved it.
That's so cool. Tell us now about Angel Park. Really hits its peak somewhere around 96, 97. Tell us just a little bit about what that was like and how the golf course had grown in those first 5-6 years.
So the first two holes of the original Palm golf course design were much too difficult. They were difficult anyway, but to be the first two holes, it just started off everything at a bad, impression. So because the Cargill family had more money invested than they ever intended, they needed, in Orrin's mind, another revenue center, which was brilliant. And so we found a way to shoehorn in two other holes somewhere else out on the Palm golf course to end up with an 18-hole golf course. But we took holes 1 and 2 completely out of play, and he built Cloud 9.
Right. So Cloud 9 exists now where 1 and 2 were, and now what is number 1 tee box and hole on the Palm golf course used to be number 3. And I always thought that was interesting. Tell us a little bit about, one of the things that came up with Robbie Becker, because we were working in the cart barn at the time, is we were really, really busy in those years. Just tell us some of the numbers, the sheer numbers that were happening here at Angel Park.
Well, by 97 and 97, 98 were the best years. Phil Green was the general manager at that time. I was working some other duties with OB Sports, but I was still involved with Angel Park, and they would approach 55,000 rounds paid on each the Mountain and the Palm. They would have about 30,000 rounds paid on Cloud 9, and they would have 17,000, 18,000 on the putting course. And just, it was a giant operation, and everybody had great fun, and the Cargill's family ended up happy because they got their money back, and things were really good.
Yeah, everything was really neat from Angel Park's perspective on there. So that grows your golf story out of Angel Park. Yeah, I know you did some work with OB Sports for a few years there, had a couple different projects, but eventually you find a golf course that I know you're really proud of that you ended up finishing your career at. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Wekopa outside of Phoenix and Fountain Hills?
Okay. The years with OB Sports were fabulous for me. Golf has always been good to me, but the combination of OB and golf was great. And I got to, OB wanted to manage golf courses, but they also built golf courses for other owners. And then when the Cargills came in and an investment group out of Houston came in, OB Sports got a lot bigger, and they built their own golf courses that they owned. And so in 2001, I had moved back to Arizona, and I was coming back one Sunday evening from being in the mountains on Thanksgiving weekend and saw that there was some construction out in the desert. Didn't know what that was, but I was intrigued. And so I called an irrigation supply company in Phoenix and said, what did I see? And they said, it is a golf course. I went out and introduced myself, found out a lot more about it. And it was the Yavapai Tribal Nation building their first golf course at their hotel casino called Fort McDowell.
Yeah, and Wekopa is a really nice golf course, has been rated pretty highly all those years since. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because Wekopa and I think True North were really the best golf courses you could play in Arizona for at least 10 years.
Yes. So I did get an interview. I had officially left OB Sports as a employee, but we were still on great terms and friends. And so during the interview, surprisingly, the tribal nation selected us instead of Troon. Those were the two finalists. And so then in order to get that done, to make that happen, OB was a partner. I was a partner with OB, and we created a little company that finished the contract for them, the construction. We had an 11-year contract, or 11-month contract to finish the construction, get the first golf course up and running. And that was in February of 2001. 9/11 happens, and it's in October, and the golf industry is a little in turmoil. The whole world has been impacted. And so the tribal nation asked me if we needed to redo the business plan and the 5-year projection. And I said, well, we were pretty conservative with it anyway. I like it. No, we don't. I don't need to revise it. And so they gave us a 3-year contract. And at the end of the 3 years, they gave us a 5-year extension. And at the end of that, which was a total of 8 years, they gave us another 5-year extension. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So now we've covered 5 decades of your life in golf. I'd like to know a little bit about some of the differences and the transitions, and we can go a lot of different ways with this. One of the things that a lot of people find interesting on this show are the discussions of improvement, lessons, the golf swing, golf equipment, and I'm just going to kind of let you pick maybe 1 or 2 things that you want to talk about, just about the changes in golf over all those years.
Golf has been a sport that has constantly evolved, mostly through technology. Now, the players themselves are smarter, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're more athletic. But technology has had a huge impact. It's a complex game. It's a hard game to learn. And one thing about instruction is when you're trying to learn the game, you really don't know who to believe or what to believe. You've got an instructor there telling you you're doing this. That doesn't feel like that. But you've got to accept what he thinks is best, or you have to move on to somebody else. So one of the really big recent technical advances is TrackMan. Somewhere in the 1990s, all the Eastern Europe bloc nations had just broken away from Russia, and they were their own countries. And I think that happened in 92. But Belgium, or Denmark, was a country that was worried about an invasion. And so on their military side, they engaged a guy by the name of Frederik Tuxen, which was a radar engineer, to create software and the technology to map any kind of aggression. And they were primarily worried about missiles. And so he came up with software that would, some 800 miles away, would detect immediately that there's something coming towards Denmark.
And be able to map it.
And then the technology was even more than just alerting. It would measure the speed, it would measure the descending trajectory, it would measure the exact target. And so Denmark then spent more money and time and effort to intercept those things.
Right.
Somewhere after that technology existed of recognizing this incoming object, some golf enthusiasts got with Tuxen and said, can you reverse this? And can we apply it to golf? And they've actually applied it to baseball too. But he said, well, sure we can. And so that was somewhere around 2000, they reversed it. They got patents on it. And then really somewhere around 2005, 2006, the tour players started using it religiously.
And the example that you used with me in the past with TrackMan is Dustin Johnson. Everyone who knows who Dustin Johnson is. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how TrackMan helped his game?
TrackMan's affected a lot of people, but let's just use Dustin as an example that I've read about. He was working with Harmon, and having his weakest part of his game was his wedge games and the part shots, but maybe let's say 130 and in, the 70, the 80, the 90-yard shots. And when you're working with somebody and you're trying to improve your game, you've got to believe in something. What the golf pros used to do would look at their divots, the depth of them, the direction of them, or whatever. You could ignore them, but they wouldn't lie to you.
Right.
And TrackMan, though, told them everything in an instant. Told them exact distance, told them the trajectory, told them the angle of descent. And so by using TrackMan, Dustin Johnson, within 4 or 5 months, was able to improve dramatically because he was actually helping himself, not having to rely on anybody else, and he used it.
Yep, I think that's great. And let's go back even a little bit more about technological advances. Let's talk about blades and cavity backs and how that started and what the differences are.
Well, Karsten was a big leader in the industry there. In my opinion, he started with a putter, but then it transcended into an iron. And previous to ping, a set of irons, the metal would all be kind of consistent from the heel to the toe. They would have different offsets and different heights, but they were pretty much the same from one manufacturer to another. Karsten was an engineer for Honeywell, and golf was a hobby of his, and he came up with the idea of taking weight out of the center of the club and putting extra weight in the heel and the toe, which actually improved the efficiency of the club. It didn't enlarge the sweet spot like a lot of people say, because that's still the center of gravity, but the mishits were so much better, and it dramatically changed it. One thing Karsten did that was disallowed by the USGA was he created a bent shaft, and Joel Goldstrand was the first one to use it, and he played marvelously with it. The grip was at a slightly less angle than the shaft that went into the club head. And so it wasn't a straight line like the rules of golf say. He had it the grip was like 7 degrees off. But what it did was it made the transition of the release of the club automatic. The impact and the weight of the club out there swinging on a bent shaft transitioned beautifully. But
so that's
USGA said no,
made it illegal
too
right
easy,
away.
it's illegal.
And I know that you talked all my life about the difference between persimmon heads and the technology of the woods and the drivers, which are similar in some ways too. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So I love persimmon. That's what I grew up with. So they start out with hickory shafts, and they would really bend, and you had to use your hands and arms to play with hickory shafts. When they came out with the steel shafts, the early pros, Demerit and some of the other guys, Kerry Middlecoff, realized that you could really hit it with your body, and you didn't have to be so handy and use your arms so much. And then Hogan was the one that came out and figured out how you could create lag with a steel shaft. Couldn't create lag with any of the other shafts. And then with persimmon, that was the head made for the woods, and it was a block of wood. And it would deteriorate with a golf ball constantly hitting the face. So they put a plastic insert in it, but in order to make the wood last longer, they pressed oil into it under pressure, and it was called an oil-hardened block. And then you had to varnish it so that oil wouldn't evaporate or wouldn't leave when you left your clubs in your trunk of the car or something like that. So they were very inefficient, and they required precise impact. When the cavity metal-headed woods came to be, you could move the center of gravity and the moment of inertia around by the way you shaped the metal or the titanium or the graphite and everything else that they used. So you could now then swing harder. You didn't have to be as precise with your impact, and you could still get great results.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bubba Watson would have harder time swing, and even Justin Thomas swinging off of their feet at impact with a persimmon, you had to be more precise.
Yeah.
But today's club allows you to do that, and so they're more powerful.
And the golf ball's changed too.
Dramatically. The Titleist had the K1 ball for a lot of years, and then Spalding came along with a solid ball called Top Flight. And then out of that, Titleist and their technologies and the patents were created for the 3-piece, 4-piece, 5-piece golf ball that were all solid, but that was the forerunner of the Pro V1, which now everybody's copied. I mean, TaylorMade and Shrixon and everybody has got great technology with solid golf balls.
The evolutions of golf, when you've talked about them all my life, I just think are really neat. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that have changed that you don't like. What are some of the things that you wish you could change about golf, either back or forward?
I'm of the age and the same opinion of other people my age. I'm 73. Jack Nicklaus is 87, I believe. It just seems like it required a little more precision when it was persimmon clubs. And today, you can be more aggressive. You can play a whole different game. You can ignore hazards. You can hit the ball better out of a 6-inch rough with the technology. I would like to see some sort of a rollback. Now, that's just because I'm an old
purist.
fart.
You're a golf purist.
I'm an old fart. They just had a players meeting at the Memorial, and the majority of the players don't want to roll back. So it's controversial. I have no idea. I'm not a decision maker. I will be interested in seeing if they do it and what the reaction would be if they did, but they may not.
As a lifer and someone who in some, you could make an argument that golf is your first love. What's your favorite thing about golf? I know that's putting you on the spot, but what's your favorite thing about golf?
Your success is determined by your score. All right. Now that's determined by your ability and your belief in yourself. So no matter who you are, no matter where you're from, I mean, you can be from South America, you can be from Asia, Europe, it just doesn't matter. If you can shoot a better score than everybody else, you quickly evolve to the top. There's not a referee, like in basketball tonight, will say, you walked or you fouled the guy. There's none of that. There's no interpretation of whether a 73 beats a 77. And for God's sake, a 68 will beat 70 every day. So all you have to do is shoot a number. And it doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter your education. I love that it identifies the best players.
That's a pretty good answer. That's going to take us to the end of the first section of the show. Thanks, Dad. I knew that golf story would be fun and interesting. And so this part of the show is where we ask the same 5 questions to everyone. We call it our par 5, and come up with some different answers. I'm very curious and interested on how these are going to go. So yeah, let's start with question number 1. What's your favorite golf movie?
Oh, well, so Caddyshack and Tin Cup are funny. I laughed. I enjoyed them, but my favorite golf movie is Seve. So it's a 2-hour movie, partly documentary and partly a movie.
So Seve Ballesteros is who that's about, and I know he's always been one of your favorites. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about Seve?
Well, he came from very humble beginnings. His family were farmers in a small little Spanish town. They did have a golf course there, I think a 9-hole golf course, not sure. But Seve's father was more lenient than my father. Seve's father would let him go play on the beach. So Seve just figured out the game himself. He figured out that's what he loved. He caddied at the golf course, and as a caddy and a non-member, you weren't allowed to play in events, but eventually everybody recognized his ability and they said, come on, let's let the kid play. He did. He played well, and he went on to play. But the thing that I really admire about Seve is the United States dominated the Ryder Cup in the beginning. So it was the United States against Great Britain and Ireland. Jack Nicklaus was even the one that said, hey, maybe you could include all of Europe, and it would be a little more competitive. And the R&A decided they would do that. And so that was at the same time Seve was coming along. And so Seve and his belief in himself and confidence and maybe even arrogance convinced his fellow players that they could beat the Americans. So
and
that's what I had.
This is a fun lineup. Why don't you tell us about those early Ryder Cup teams for Europe?
So at the same time that Seve was, the first year that Seve was really eligible to play, Faldo was coming along, Ian Woosnam was coming along, Sandy Lyle, and Bernhard Langer. And, of course, they all wanted to play well. They all wanted to beat the Americans, but it was really Seve convincing them they could. Now, Nick Faldo was criticized by the press, and they called him El Foldo because he had a hard time finishing tournaments. But Seve lifted everybody up, and the press has mislabeled a whole lot of people, Tom Watson and a lot of others too. But Faldo even did a couple things that were unusual. He went to a psychiatrist to help him understand the pressures of tournament golf, and the psychiatrist actually put him in knight's metal armor physically. And the example was, now the press, media, and anything they say is deflected off of you. It doesn't matter. You can ignore them.
He literally put him in a suit of armor.
He did. And then he also hired an acting coach there in London to help him understand stage fright. So there was a big learning curve. Golf is a big learning curve for everybody, but for the underdogs, it's even bigger. And I just admire Seve because he convinced all of these guys. And they were all different. Bernhard Langer is very different than Ian Woosnam and stuff. But eventually, each one of those five guys were a major winner.
Oh, sure.
And when this all started and Seve was telling them, we can do it, none of them had won any major.
That's so fun. Question number 2. What's your favorite golf club in your bag and why?
The most valuable club in competition is the putter. But it's not exciting. It should be. But I found the driver the favorite club because when I was playing in my earnest, it was persimmon. And so the feeling to hit a perfect tee shot in the center of the face just made the rest of the hole better. And if you can get an advantage with the driver by being closer or in better position than your opponents, then you've got a greater chance of winning. And so while the putter's
the most important,
the driver's the most fun, and it really lifts you up.
That's great. Question number 3, my favorite question, is your dream foursome. So if you could pick any 3 people, alive or dead, to play golf with, who would you play with and where would you play? As a disclaimer, I know that just on sheer family members alone, sons and wives, that you probably wouldn't be able to narrow it down if you went the family route. So I'm going to give you an out, and you don't have to pick family members. Who would you choose if you could play golf with anybody alive or dead?
Yeah, so I actually have 2 golfing families. I have the family with you and Bonnie, but we lost Bonnie. And then I remarried, so now we got more than a foursome.
A lot of golfers.
So thank you. I wouldn't want to offend anybody, but it would probably be an eightsome. I would like to think that I could caddy for a group, and then I could play with a group. The group I would play with would be my 2 mentors and my father. My father, of course, was a mentor, but then Hub Goy and Bill Major. That would be really fun to go back and during the round, thank them for everything they've done. Boy, if I could caddy, I wouldn't want to play because I would be embarrassed. It would be overwhelming. But there are 6 golfers that I think in history have just been outstanding. And Peter Thompson and Gene Littler, Ernie Els, Adam Scott, Louis Oosthuizen, and Retief Goosen. If I could just walk along with those 6 guys while they played, it would just be a blast.
I think that's really neat.
I'd carry 6 sets.
Why are they your favorites? What do they have in common?
I think it's their demeanor, the way they carried themselves on the golf course. Their tempo is beautiful, and their simplicity to their golf swings. It's not complicated. Even though the golf swing is complicated, these guys have the magic of making it look easy.
Yeah, that's cool. Where would you play? You've played, let's get this out of the way. You've played pretty much globally. I know you've played some of the best courses in the world, many of them. So this might be a difficult choice. It might not. Where would you play?
So there are beautiful golf courses, wonderful golf courses everywhere. Scotland, England, Ireland, Australia. But the most beautiful golf course for a walk in the park, maybe towards sunset, late afternoon, would be Cypress Point. You've got 6 holes in the forest, you got 6 holes in the dunes, and you got about 3-4 holes on the ocean.
On the water.
On the rocks, yeah.
And I know that you have said before that you have a favorite course because of its almost difficulty, a golf purist answer. So why don't you give us that answer too? Because I know Cypress Point is your prettiest golf course.
Competitively, I think Shinnecock is so demanding of all aspects of the game. So Shinnecock Hills out in Long Island, it's every time they've had a major championship, they have produced a fantastic winner. It's a true test.
That's fun. Question number 4, what's your aiming fluid on the golf course? Now, I've been looking forward to this answer for a long time. I already know what the answer is. You drink Coors Light over ice, and I thought that was interesting. But I want to get a little more into that you didn't necessarily want to drink during your competitive days, but that you would have 1 or 2. And that's the reason for the question, actually, is because so many golfers have a couple of drinks and they feel more comfortable. And that's universal to golfers, whether they've hidden it or not. Just as recently as Netflix last year and Joel Damon having some White Claws at the turn in a U.S. Open qualifying. It's not anything that's foreign to golf. Tell us a little bit about the dynamic between alcohol and golf.
Well, golf is complex, and I like to think that it's you competing against yourself. It really is. It's you competing against yourself. In football, you can blitz the quarterback, and in basketball, you can block the shot. But in golf, you can't affect the other player. So if you're going to win, you have to be the better self. You have to be the better player. Nerves and anxiety and self-doubt play a huge part during the competitive round, and you have this internal conflict. So alcohol was too potent. I mean, like whiskey, that was too potent. But beer would kind of gradually get into your system, and so I would put it over ice. One, because I didn't want to get gassy and full and belch. I wanted to feel better, but it would take the carbonation out. But I liked Coors Light because I could have 1 or 2, and it had a calming effect, a dullness. Now, I had a good friend that would drink 8 or 9, and there was a tipping point that he could go too far.
I've been waiting for Larry Webb to come up. I know that his son and potentially even Larry will be watching this. Larry was one of the guys that you grew up playing with. You've told me privately that Larry was one of the best players you've ever played with. And he tended to drink a lot. So tell us a little bit about the advantages that he would gain from drinking and how that worked to his advantages and his disadvantages sometimes.
Yeah, so Larry and I met in junior golf in Denver when I would travel from Montrose over to the bigger city. So known Larry for a long time. He played the tour, I think, 2 different times, a year each. He was able to get there. Because of nerves and anxiety, he wasn't able to stay there. It wasn't his golf ability, it was his emotional ability to handle himself. And beer helped him a great deal. And one year in 82-83, won the National Club Pro Championship at La Quinta in Palm Desert. A nice player. I played with him on and off one summer where he won 5 state opens in 4 months. I mean, he won the Arizona Open, the Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Utah. He made $93,000 in 1984 or something.
Insane. That's
just
so
off
fun.
of the little tournaments. He would drink a beer or two, maybe before teeing off. And then he would drink a couple, 3, 4 more. And it really helped. It helped calm the nerves. But then there was a point that it made it worse too. So if he could stay on the positive side, he would beat everybody. There were times when we all tip over to the other side and we don't beat anybody.
That's interesting. And you had another interesting story about drinking on the golf course. I think it was with Fred Marty, who was another friend of yours. Why don't you tell us that story?
Fred from Houston, Texas, and played the tour back when it was just the low 60 were automatically qualified for the following year. And he played it 13 consecutive years and was in the top 60 money winners every year. Anyway, he's in Milwaukee, and they're playing at Deer Run and the Greater Milwaukee Open. And he and Dave Hill are tied for the lead with the last round. And, of course, they're going to Crenshaw, I think, is about 6 back. And so everybody thinks it's either going to be Dave Hill or Fred that's going to win. And so their tee time's about 1. It's 11:30, and he's in having lunch in the club. And Davey Hill's over across in another table, and he's drinking gin and tonic at 11 o'clock. And so a couple of guys are saying, Fred, you're going to win. Congratulations. And so as it happens, Dave has a cup with him while he plays. And Dave shoots 65 and Fred shoots 70, and so Dave Hill walks away with the tournament. So there are times, and it's happened year after year after year with numerous players. Some players in the Gary McCord era started experimenting with beta blockers, and those work too. But there have been all kinds of experiments to control your inner nerves in competition. Guys have gone to all kinds of lengths to find the perfect solution.
That's a very cool answer. And
however, the water's the best thing you can do.
Water's the best thing. And that's,
I don't want to mislead anybody.
Water comes up the most on this show. So that's great too. So talking about nerves, that brings us to the last question of the show. Dad, thank you for coming on. It's really cool. But question number 5 is always fun because we get to know a little bit about self-control and nerves. So when you're on the golf course, and back in the day when you would hit a bad shot, what's the one word or phrase that you tended to repeat more than others? Because golfers tend to have one.
Yeah, anger, right? Anger gets the best of everybody. As a youngster and watching the really good players, I noticed that the best players don't have a fit of anger that's visible. I mean, there's internal struggle. So I have always tried to not display any anger. The guys that I do see, I believe, lack self-confidence, do see erupt into a fit. They want people to think they weren't the player that just hit that horrible shot.
Yeah, they're better than that.
So I really think golf is a management of errors, one error after a next. I mean, you hit a tee shot and it might be in the fairway, but you yourself know it's a little on the toe or it's a little low on the face or whatever, a little bit in the heel. You may end up hitting that 6-iron on the green, but it may not be the shot you had envisioned, and only you know it. Nobody else knows that. So I believe that you're better if you don't. I try not to, but there's times I can't help it. And so I, in the past, have just snapped a golf club. Without a yell or a scream, I would just break it.
I knew this answer, but only recently. We just talked about this a couple days ago. And I know that probably is a little bit difficult for you to admit that you're a club snapper, but it tickled me to know, obviously. And so my initial immediate follow-up question is how many clubs do you think you've snapped in your day?
So kind of early, I would throw a couple and my dad got on me. So I probably have broken 3 or 4 in events, but you don't want to do that. It's because later in the round
Can't
you're going to
use the club anymore.
You're going to need to use the club. So it's really stupid. But probably 3 or 4 in friendly rounds, where you're just drinking or having fun and you got a $5 bet or something. I have probably maybe a dozen times or something. But anyway, I'm under 20. I got less than 20.
That's perfect.
Lifetime.
And it's a great way to stop. Thanks again, Dad. I'm not going to get choked up like I did a minute ago. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, until next time, hit 'em straight from your friends at Angel Park. Woo! Cheers.